The dense forest seemed almost inviting in the twilight, with a cool breeze rustling through the leaves and the faint chirping of crickets beginning to fill the air. Ethan was an experienced camper, having spent countless nights under the stars in various remote locations. This time, however, he decided to venture deeper into the woods, far from any well-trodden path, where the silence was pure and undisturbed. As night fell, Ethan set up his tent in a small clearing surrounded by towering pines. The quietness was profound, almost overwhelming, and he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Dismissing it as the natural eeriness of being alone, he lit a small campfire and settled down with a book, letting the warmth of the flames ease his nerves. Hours passed, and the fire began to die down. The woods grew darker, and the familiar sounds of night faded into a suffocating silence. Just as Ethan was about to crawl into his sleeping bag, he heard it, a distant rhythmic thumping. It was faint, but unmistakable, like the sound of a heavy object being dragged across the forest floor. Curiosity and fear warred within him as he strained to hear more. The sound grew louder, closer, until it seemed to circle the clearing. The thumping was joined by a low, guttural moan that sent shivers down his spine. Ethan's heart raced as he reached for his flashlight, casting its beam into the darkness. But there was nothing, just the empty forest, the trees swaying gently in the wind. Suddenly, the noises stopped. The silence was more terrifying than the sounds had been. Ethan stood frozen, waiting, listening. Then, from the corner of his eye, he saw it, a figure barely visible in the shadows at the edge of the clearing. It was tall and gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to glow with a dim, unnatural light. The figure's mouth moved, but no sound came out. Panic surged through Ethan as he stumbled backward, tripping over his gear and landing hard on the ground. The figure remained still, watching him with those empty eyes. Desperation overtook him, and he scrambled to his feet, grabbing his flashlight and pointing it directly at the figure. But the light passed through it as if it wasn't there, as if it were just a shadow. Ethan's breath came in ragged gasps as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. The figure began to move, gliding silently toward him. Its form shifted and distorted, as though it were made of smoke. Ethan backed away, but the figure was relentless, closing the distance between them with each passing second. Just as the figure was within arm's reach, Ethan's instincts kicked in, and he turned and ran. He tore through the forest, branches scratching at his face and clothes, the underbrush tripping him up at every step. The sound of the figure's pursuit was terrifyingly silent, but he could feel its presence right behind him, an icy chill seeping into his bones. His lungs burned as he ran, his legs threatening to give out. He had no idea where he was going, only that he had to get away. But no matter how fast he ran, the figure was always there, just out of sight, just out of reach. The forest around him seemed to close in, the trees twisting and warping as if they were alive, as if they were trying to trap him. Finally, exhausted and terrified, Ethan burst into another clearing. He fell to his knees, gasping for breath, his body trembling with fear. The figure had disappeared, but the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. He looked around, trying to find some semblance of safety, but the clearing was empty, save for a single ancient tree at its center. The tree was massive, its gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. Something about it drew Ethan in, despite his terror. He stumbled toward it, unable to resist the pull. As he approached, he noticed something carved into the bark, a series of names, dozens of them, each one followed by a date. The most recent name was his own, followed by that very night's date. Horror seized him as he realized the truth. The figure wasn't just a ghost, it was a warning, a harbinger of death. The names on the tree belonged to those who had ventured into these woods alone, never to return. And now, his name was among them. Ethan tried to turn back, to flee, but his body wouldn't obey. The air around him grew heavy, pressing down on him, rooting him to the spot. The ground beneath him began to tremble, and from the base of the tree, the earth split open, revealing a dark, gaping chasm. From within the chasm came the faint sound of whispers, countless voices murmuring in unison. Ethan tried to scream, but no sound escaped his lips. The darkness reached up, tendrils of shadow wrapping around his legs, pulling him toward the abyss. Desperation filled him as he struggled against the unseen force, but it was no use. The shadows were too strong, too relentless. They dragged him closer and closer to the edge, the whispers growing louder, more insistent. As he was pulled into the darkness, the last thing he saw was the figure standing by the tree, watching him with those hollow, glowing eyes. And then, there was nothing. Just darkness, silence, and the cold, crushing weight of the earth. The next morning, the clearing was empty, save for the ancient tree. The forest was silent, the only sound the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. And on the tree, a new name had appeared, freshly carved into the bark, marking the end of another lost soul. Jenna had always been drawn to the solitude of nature. The idea of spending a weekend alone in a remote cabin, miles away from civilization, filled her with a sense of peace and freedom. The old cabin she found online was perfect, isolated, nestled deep within the mountains, surrounded by towering trees and a clear, glistening lake. She arrived late in the afternoon, the sun casting long shadows across the landscape. The cabin was as rustic as the pictures had shown, with a small porch, a single room, and a stone fireplace. It was cozy, exactly what she had hoped for. Jenna unpacked her things, eager to relax and enjoy the quiet. As night fell, Jenna built a fire in the fireplace and settled into a worn, comfortable armchair. The warmth of the flames and the soft crackling of the wood was soothing, lulling her into a sense of contentment. She spent the evening reading, the only sounds the occasional hoot of an owl and the wind rustling through the trees. But as the fire died down and the cabin grew colder, Jenna began to feel uneasy. The silence became oppressive, the shadows in the corners of the room darker, deeper. She shook off the feeling, telling herself it was just the unfamiliarity of the place. Still, she couldn't shake the sensation of being watched, of something lurking just beyond the reach of the firelight. She decided to call it a night, hoping sleep would ease her nerves. But as she lay in bed, the feeling of unease only grew stronger. The cabin was too quiet, too still. She could hear her own heartbeat, the blood rushing in her ears. And then, just as she was drifting off, she heard it, a soft, barely audible whisper. Jenna froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The whisper came again, faint but unmistakable. It was coming from outside the cabin, from the direction of the lake. She strained to hear, her breath shallow, trying to make out the words. But the whisper was too soft, too distant, like a voice carried on the wind. Terrified but unable to resist, Jenna got out of bed and crept to the window. The moonlight illuminated the lake, casting an eerie glow on the still water. At first, she saw nothing, just the calm surface of the lake and the trees swaying gently in the breeze. But then, she saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the water, staring directly at the cabin. The figure was tall and thin, its features obscured by the darkness. Jenna's blood ran cold as the figure slowly raised its hand and pointed at the cabin, at her. She stumbled back from the window, her mind racing. Who was it? What did they want? She grabbed her phone, intending to call for help, but there was no signal, no way to reach anyone. The whisper came again, louder this time, as if it were inside the cabin with her. Jenna's fear turned to panic as she searched for something, anything to protect herself. But the cabin was empty, devoid of any weapons or means of defense. The whisper grew louder, more insistent, filling the room with an otherworldly presence. Jenna's terror reached its peak as the cabin door creaked open on its own. The figure from the lake was standing in the doorway, its face still hidden in shadow. It stepped inside, moving with an unnatural grace, the whispering now a cacophony of voices all around her. She tried to scream, but no sound came out, her voice caught in her throat by sheer terror. The figure moved closer, its features slowly becoming visible in the dim light of the dying fire. Its face was gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to bore into her soul. The whispers surrounded her, filling her mind with incomprehensible words, driving her to the brink of madness. She backed away, but there was nowhere to go, no way to escape. In a last, desperate attempt to flee, Jenna ran for the door, but the figure was faster. It reached out, its icy hand closing around her wrist, its touch sending a jolt of pure fear through her body. The whispers intensified, drowning out all other thoughts, until they were all she could hear, all she could think about. The figure leaned in close, its breath cold against her skin, and whispered a single word in her ear. The word was alien, incomprehensible, yet it filled her with a dread unlike anything she had ever known. The room began to spin, the walls closing in, the shadows deepening into an inky blackness that threatened to consume her. Jenna's vision blurred, her body weakening as the figure's grip tightened. The last thing she saw before she lost consciousness was the figure's hollow eyes, glowing with a sickly light, and the twisted smile that spread across its face. The whispers became a deafening roar, and then there was nothing but darkness. When Jenna awoke, she was lying on the shore of the lake, the cabin nowhere in sight. The sun was rising, casting a warm glow over the water, but the terror of the night before was still fresh in her mind. She scrambled to her feet and fled, never looking back, the memory of that horrible night haunting her every step. To this day, she refuses to speak of what she saw, but the whispering still haunts her dreams. Darren was an avid hiker, always in search of new trails and unexplored paths. When he heard about Blackwood Trail, a remote and seldom traveled route deep in the mountains, he was eager to take on the challenge. The trail was rumored to be haunted, but Darren dismissed the stories as local folklore, nothing more than campfire tales meant to scare tourists. He set out early in the morning, the sky clear and the air crisp with the scent of pine. The trail was narrow and winding, cutting through dense forests and steep hillsides. As he hiked, Darren couldn't help but notice how quiet it was. There were no birds, no rustling leaves, just an eerie, oppressive silence that seemed to hang over the entire area. By midday, Darren had reached a small clearing where he decided to set up camp for the night. The clearing was surrounded by thick woods, the trees casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and twist in unnatural ways. Despite the unsettling atmosphere, Darren pushed the feeling of unease aside and focused on setting up his tent. As evening fell, Darren lit a fire and settled in for the night. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the occasional crackle of the fire. The woods felt alive, as if the trees were watching him, waiting for something. Darren tried to shake off the feeling, convincing himself it was just his imagination playing tricks on him. But as the night grew darker, the feeling of being watched became unbearable. He heard the faint sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the trees. Darren grabbed his flashlight and shone it into the woods, but there was nothing there, just the dark, impenetrable forest. The footsteps stopped, and the silence returned, heavier than before. Hours passed, and Darren found himself unable to sleep. The fire had long since died out, and the darkness was complete. Then, just as he was about to drift off, he heard it, a voice low and gravelly, whispering his name from somewhere deep in the woods. Darren's blood ran cold as he sat up, straining to hear more. The voice came again, closer this time, still whispering his name. It was a voice he didn't recognize, rough and menacing, filled with malice. Darren's heart pounded in his chest as he grabbed his flashlight and stood up, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. But the woods were still, eerily so, as if holding their breath. Panic set in as the voice continued, now coming from all around him, as if the trees themselves were speaking. The words were unintelligible, but the tone was clear. He was not welcome here. Darren tried to call out, to demand who was there, but his voice caught in his throat, choked by fear. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw something move. A shadow, darker than the night itself, slithered between the trees, moving closer with each passing second. Darren's fear turned to terror as he realized the shadow was coming straight for him, its shape shifting and twisting, growing larger as it approached. He backed away, his mind racing for a plan, but the shadow was relentless. It moved with an unnatural speed, closing the distance between them in a heartbeat. Darren turned and ran, his legs carrying him through the forest as fast as they could. The trees seemed to close in around him, the branches clawing at his clothes and skin, trying to hold him back. The shadow pursued him, its presence like a cold weight pressing down on him. Darren's breath came in ragged gasps as he sprinted through the forest, but no matter how fast he ran, he couldn't escape the feeling of the shadow right behind him, reaching out with unseen hands to drag him back. He stumbled into another clearing, his legs giving out beneath him as he collapsed to the ground. The shadow stopped at the edge of the clearing, hovering just out of reach, as if waiting for something. Darren's fear was overwhelming, paralyzing him as he watched the shadow shift and twist, forming a vague humanoid shape. The voice came again, now louder, more menacing. It echoed through the clearing, the words still unintelligible but filled with rage. The shadow began to move again, gliding toward him with an almost predatory grace. Darren tried to crawl away, but his body wouldn't respond, frozen in terror. The shadow loomed over him, its form towering and shapeless. The voice spoke directly into his mind, filling him with a fear so intense it threatened to consume him. The darkness around him deepened, the world fading away until there was nothing but the shadow, the voice, and the cold, crushing weight of despair. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the shadow was gone. The voice fell silent, and the forest returned to its unnatural stillness. Darren was left lying in the clearing, shaking with fear. The memory of the shadow burned into his mind. He never spoke of what he encountered on Blackwood Trail, but he never returned to the mountains again. The shadow, the voice, the darkness, they haunted him for the rest of his days, a constant reminder of the terror that lurked in the woods.